Jen Leland to hold space for us in exploration of how we create the systems and structures that support our renewal. Um, Sometimes we need to burn them down and start anew, right? And I just want to say personally, had no idea how much I would learn about myself through my care for others. And Jen, you've been instrumental in helping me reflect on the role I play in the experience of the healing of other folks. And so I am grateful for that. I look forward to what it is you offer us here, and I hand it over to you.
Thank you, Oriana. And I hope everybody can hear me okay for the sound check. It is such an honor to be here. I have to say, I think that I have changed and pivoted what I was going to do 1,000 times in the last 2 hours together, almost 2 hours, just out of deep respect and honoring for what's come before. So if my slides seem a little all over the place or I've pivoted too much, I ask for your grace in that. So yeah, my name's Jen Leland, she, her, fluid pronouns. Leora put in the chat, one of the founders of SCRR. Yes, I had the honor and privilege to be with maybe some of you who are on today too in that role. Yeah, I'm just going to take a moment and just express the gratitude for being in this collective space with you all, for Savannah and Sue who came before me. And I'm going to do my best to integrate their teachings and their wisdom into our practice together for the next 40 minutes or so. And so, yeah, inviting you all to take care of yourselves in the way you need to throughout this presentation. I'm going to be talking about the landscape. So we just came from the body, dropping into the body, the somatics of the body, the centering of the body. And my little offering here today is inviting us all to begin to expand from the self and the body toward the collective body, the structures, the conditions, that really have such an influence over our healing, liberation, and transformation. And I know that that's sort of the theme of today. So I wanted to bring that forward, but I want to also invite us into this practice, which is, for me personally, so much harder than it sounds coming out of my mouth, which is how do we attend to the structures, conditions, contexts that we live in, that we're purposed in, that we get to be in every day with young people? How do we pay attention to that while still staying connected to our bodies? How do we expand into the collective naming and noticing of these structures, interpersonal relationships, practices, collective and individual, the cultures that we're in every day? How do we expand into that while still really staying centered, as Sue said, centered in the belly of ourselves? We need both, especially when we are entering into systems change work. Make sense? Hopefully that makes sense. And I'm going to switch my view just so I can see more faces than my own. So today we're going to be looking at the landscape. I'm going to be talking a little bit about trauma-informed frameworks. I'm going to be talking from my role as one of the founders of Trauma Transformed, which is a partner with SCRR, and my own lived experiences as somebody working in school systems and trying to apply these trauma-informed principles to changing the really harmful and violent structures that I was seeing every day in my role as counselor, as social worker, as educator, as clinical director with more positionality and power, and still as somebody who was deeply committed to way more stories of healing and learning and transformation, and way less stories of harm and violence, and finding myself really in a lot of distress. over what I was witnessing and the powerlessness that I felt in those places, even with all my white body privilege, even with my positionality. Um, so I want to also say that I came into trauma-informed. Let me just get a pulse check if you're willing to do this. How many of you could do it with emojis? You can drop it into the chat. But how many of you are in school settings, cultures, social work, youth center cultures, contexts, organizations, community organizations where trauma-informed has become a language inside those settings? Yeah, I see some snapping, right? It's become, yes, loose, yes, thank you. Yes, thank you for the emoji love. Yes, it's become very ubiquitous. It's become very ubiquitous. And for some of, well, I'll speak for myself. So I came into the trauma-informed framework in about 2007. I was working in an NPS, a non-public school in Oakland, California. And that's, for thinking back to Savannah's mapping activities for students, mostly Black students in Oakland, disabled Black students who have been pushed out of public school settings, right? Pushed out beyond that outer circle. And they were in a placement that was outside of the public school system that was using restraints and seclusions for young students. And my role in that system was to begin to eliminate the use of restraints and seclusions. And I'm beginning with this. I know it's kind of heavy, so I kind of go toward the heaviness, but I want to be real about what brought me into trauma-informed care and trauma-informed systems and structures, and give honor to the lineage that I feel like has disappeared from a lot of our conversations around trauma-informed systems and training, which is that in one chapter of its lineage, it came from psychiatric survivors. It came from the organizing and the resistance of psychiatric survivors who were bearing the burden of restraints and seclusions in hospital settings, and who were demanding from the systems, yes, we need hospital settings sometimes. No, we don't need to be violently restrained in those settings. That's not helpful. And so I say that that's how I came into through the education field, and through that violent practice, trauma-inducing practice in particular, and looking for any framework, any language, any practices that could help hold us in that transition from being trauma-inducing, violent, towards hopefully more healing-centered practices. I also want to say that I came into this work having also been on the other end of that, right? Having been in psychiatric institutions myself as a young person, and continuation schools and residential treatment. So bearing the burden of a lot of harm from those systems, and also understanding that my white skin protected and buffered me from a lot of that harm as well. And coming into the field, really understanding at a deep level the way that stress and trauma and grief and these words on the screen were showing up in my body, and were showing up in the things that I actually was contributing to as an educator, as a social worker, as a therapist, and not being okay with that. Maybe not having the language for that, but really not being okay with that. And so we're going to talk a little bit about moral injury as well today. But I just want to, put these definitions out there. There are many, many definitions. But I want to just center us in some of these definitions of stress, of trauma, and then what I've learned through SCRR, through the School Crisis Recovery and Renewal work, especially during the pandemic, right? Especially in the context of trauma-informed care being ubiquitous in the education system. What I learned is that through the pandemic, and especially in 2021, 2022, there was a hunger and a thirst to talk about stress and trauma. And there was also an acknowledgement that we weren't actually talking about grief enough, right? That people really needed the space to talk about grief. And that there are some nuanced differences between working with grief, working with trauma, but that in the popularity and the ubiquitousness of trauma-informed care, that we were really decentering grief, and people were saying we need to talk about grief. I'm not going to read the definitions. I just put them up there to frame our conversation. Moving forward, I trust that all of you are well-versed. Most of you are well-versed in this, and probably bring your own definitions that make sense for you. But I do want to talk about language. I'm bringing this forward, trauma-informed systems, because it has been a framework that has enabled me, for all of its flaws, for all the ways that it has been that it has morphed over time in ways that I don't particularly like or find helpful. For all of that, it has still been a framework that has allowed us as a collective body to name what is happening in our structures, contexts, conditions, and systems in ways that created and enabled change that I hadn't seen before in my time in the field, right? It enabled us to have conversations with superintendents, with school site principals, with board of supervisors, with county government, with teachers, with educators, with social workers, where we could have a collective conversation. And I think back to Sue's presentation or offering just now, that allowed us to both name and notice together. It allowed us that framework. For all of its faults, it allowed us that framework. And once we were able to name and notice together something that had remained and been persistently unsayable for so long, that enables some ability to change the conditions, to disrupt the conditions that are creating so much trauma and stress. So I'm going to be talking about naming, noticing today, and also thinking about our language. And I wanted to bring this particular naming forward today, because I think that many people have been well versed in this moment around trauma and definitely burnout, right? Educator burnout. But I'm curious about those who work in school settings, whether there has been as much conversation about moral injury or demoralized educators. I think that's an important distinction for folks. It has been helpful for the educators in my community. Burnout has been ubiquitous, like trauma-informed care, and lends itself to a language that then places the burden and the solution in the individual educator, and removes and silences the way that structures and systems injure us in the workplace. And so there's a moral injury definition up on the slide, and I will just simplify it a little bit and just say the definition that also works for me is, we know, because we've been curious and we've been listening to young people and students, we know on some level what they need and don't need through our relationships with them, and we cannot give it to them. And this feeling of distress wears us down. It creates wear and tear on our body, our individual bodies, and wear and tear on our collective bodies, and leads to demoralization. That invites us into a different kind of structural change, even just naming the structures at play, than burnout does. With burnout, we get lots of self-care, totally important, right? Lots of practices that carve out space for us to attend to our own care. With moral injury or demoralization, we begin to think about what are the structures that are continually and perpetuating injury to us. And that creates a different call to action within ourselves, within our systems. So I want to stop here. I will put into the tools some recovery tools for educator moral injury. There's been a lot of work in the field of educator moral injury. I've just scratched the surface of that. I come from the health field around moral injury and have just really scratched the surface of educator moral injury, but I'll put some links into my slides to be handed out later. But just stopping here and wondering from you all, does this definition make sense? Are you familiar with it? Can you think about ways? I heard that, in Savannah's presentation early on, I saw folks putting into the chat, yes, BIPOC students continually getting suspended and pushed out of schools. And myself as an educator am bearing witness to that. And when I read that chat, I don't know who it was in our collective here, but when I read that, I thought, yep, moral injury. Dimitri, 100% makes sense. Yeah. Yep. It's new, eye-opening, validating, find myself curious to know what to do about it. Yes, thank you. Yeah, so we're going to be naming things. I'm going to bring in towards our ending today, like some things we can do. And also, thank you for saying this, Nicole, like the naming, sometimes we get so caught up in the what do we do, what's the action? And I just want to bring us back to that landscape slide, that naming it, acknowledging it in ourselves, naming what is happening for us inside, what is happening on the outside in our structures is part of the doing. The doing can't happen, the change can't happen without that first awareness. Yeah, thank you for all the chats coming through. Hopes worked through the reflecting and recovering from moral injury worksheet and the BIPOC being pushed out by police a week or so ago. Yes. Yes. Yeah. One of the things to do that's in the recovery tool for educator moral injury is to start with compassion, right? Compassion for self and widening out that compassion. And it's not the same as condoning, right? But it's understanding that we are all operating in a context and condition that creates stress, that creates woundedness, that creates injury. And how do we begin to name that, bring some compassion to that versus shame, so that we begin to have enough energy and aliveness and collectiveness through connection, not disconnection, that we can organize for change. And again, this is part of the languaging piece. What happens when we shift? And this is also a doing for those of us who are like, yes, and we need to do something. I honor that energy. I move with that energy a lot, sometimes too much. But this languaging piece, what happens when we contribute as an individual and as a collective towards shifting the larger narrative that we're hearing in schools from educator burnout to demoralized educators? What happens when we contribute to shifting the narrative from optimal learning conditions are so rooted in working conditions of educators? Working conditions of educators are the student learning conditions. So again, themes here, just naming, noticing, languaging. And I'm going to move us to this slide. So I came into Trauma Transformed. This was about 2015, after my educator social worker days. And the conversation around trauma-informed care was really self-focused. And in many ways, it sort of slipped back there, in my opinion. I've seen it slip back there. So it was really person-focused. And at that time, it was lacking the structural analysis, what I call the structural analysis, or the collective, the conditions and the context that we all work in. So the conversation at large back then was about how does stress and trauma show up in our bodies? What are the breathing techniques we can use to regulate ourselves? There was a lot of emphasis on self-regulation. Um, but we wanted to contribute to the conversation after we named and noticed that there was a lack of focus and rigor around the way that stress and trauma impacts us collectively, impacts us on an organizational or institutional level. Um, and naming and noticing that absence allowed us the ability to then contribute and to work with others before us who had already been there and done that, to be able to uplift again what was being silenced. So I'm going to talk about this slide on the structural level. And I want folks to take a minute to just think about, back to that landscape slide, to think about the context and the conditions that you work in day to day. So what is that setting? Is it a classroom? Is it a clinic? Is it an office? Is it a school? Is it an administrative building? What is that context? And I'm going to invite you into the naming of and noticing, which is uplifted in this slide, how stress and trauma begins to impact us on the collective structural level. So if you see on the left-hand side, the trauma organized slide, we know that stress and trauma overwhelms our body, leads to disorganization, fracturing within ourselves. And if we think about this and lift this up to the collective and organizational bodies that we inhabit, that we are in, what does that look like when stress and trauma impact us on that level? And you can even think about, I invite you to think about meetings that you have to attend every week, right? Meetings that you may have to attend every week. So what do those meetings, what do your classrooms, what do the school sites, what does your clinic site look like when organized around trauma, when so impacted by stress and trauma that they have become reactive? What does it look like when the classroom is in a reactive state versus an integrated reflective state? What does it look like when your team meeting is in a numb state, that you collectively are in that numb state? What does it look like when your all staff, all department meeting is looking very fragmented? How do you show up? What do you notice about that? When I first came into one of my nonprofit organizations, I came in as one of the directors, and I was quickly onboarded and told that my job, director of clinical services, the person who had inhabited my role, had not spoken to the person who inhabited the role of director of community services for the last 2 years without HR needing to be in the office with both of them. So then you think about that. I thought about that. That's a very fragmented way. That's how stress and trauma fragmented those relationships. And then I think about, what did that mean for our so-called continuum of care for young people and families? If those two people in those roles were so fragmented and so caught up in this us versus them role that they couldn't even talk to each other without HR in the room. And what does leadership look like when impacted by stress and trauma? Maybe some of you, like myself, are in leadership roles. Through the grace and truth-telling of people that I work with, I get lots of reminders about how I look like when I'm in a leadership role under a lot of stress. Thank you. Right? And that, beginning on this column, trauma organized, this is not to shame. This is really meant to say we need to begin to notice on the collective level and name when we are in meetings that are organized around stress and trauma, inequities, harm. And in order to do that, we need to know what they look like, sound like, feel like in those moments. the first step towards pausing and disrupting and interrupting that. That middle column is trauma-informed, what we consider trauma-informed. We've changed the language a little bit from the ubiquitous SAMHSA definition, but this is really about knowledge and awareness, understanding the nature and impact of trauma and recovery, shared language, recognizing social, cultural trauma and structural oppression. Thank you for that, Kelly. I see your chat. Yeah. Yeah, really not meant to be shaming, and also uplifting. Sometimes we got to name it to change it, right? And this day so far is about, how do we notice, how do we name, how do we stay in our bodies, and also contribute to the change we long for, desire, and need, and that young people are demanding from our systems. It is not an easy lift. And I want to simplify it a little bit by just inviting us into naming and noticing and using language that hopefully can support you in your work. So trauma-informed is great and not enough, right? If we only had awareness, but we had no alignment of these principles into our practices, into our structures, into our cultures, it would not be enough. And so thinking about both the self and the system, right? If we only were able to modulate and regulate stress and trauma in ourselves and the system never changed at all, it wouldn't be enough. If we were only able to regulate and change the system, but we ourselves were not able to metabolize stress and trauma, move it through our bodies, that would not be enough. So again, going back to this self, how do we name it, notice it, change it in ourselves? And how do we also do that structurally? And so this right-hand column, healing organization, again, this is a continuum. I'm sure we go through all of these columns every single day, moment by moment. They're not phases, they're dynamic. So how do we, taking the meeting as an example, if we can see, notice, feel when our meetings are organized around trauma and stress, where there's numbness, people aren't talking, there's shutdown mode, there's disassociation, there's fragmentation. How do we also notice and name when we are in meetings, when we're in classrooms, when we have those sacred moments where we are contributing and a part of something that feels, sounds like, is like really healing centered? And it doesn't mean that there's an absence of stress. I want to say that. It doesn't mean that there's an absence of stress or trauma in those moments, but it means that we are attending to that stress and trauma, attuning to that stress and trauma, and metabolizing and moving it through us in a different way and not getting so stuck in it. So healing organizations, reflective, right? When our meetings are reflective, like today's institute, we have time for reflection. We have time to pause. We are making meaning out of the past. We have enough time and space to make meaning out of the past. We saw this happen so much in schools. There wasn't enough time, likely by design, to make meaning out of what everyone went through with the pandemic and is going through. That healing organizations and structures and practices, we know we're in it when it's growth and prevention oriented, collaborative, and not fragmented. Where we are even beginning to really grapple with what it means to really center equity and accountability. Who's defining those terms? How are we even measuring that? And where our leadership spends more time in the relational realms than the authoritarian realms. And so I just want us to stop and reflect here. If you can think about where I invited you to in the beginning, the classroom, the school site, wherever it is that you spend a lot of time in your day-to-day, your youth organization, your meetings, your staff team meetings, where do you live a lot? Where do you live a lot? Where do you spend a lot of time? And again, naming it to change it. So we've given this slide in particular is a poster that Trauma Transformed has, I won't say wheat pasted or screen printed all over the place, but has given out in hard copy a lot of different places. And I've heard back from big institutions, including school systems, where they hang it on their wall, and sometimes they are in staff meetings and somebody in that staff meeting just points to the wall and to the poster and says, "Where are we right now?" The power of language, just to name, notice in order to make change. And when we're spending more time impacted and organized around trauma and stress, we're more likely to be trauma inducing to the young people that that we are with, and they notice it too. Right? I also get the great privilege of being the clinical director at Rise Center. And young people always at that center are saying, we notice that when you all aren't doing well, when the adults around us are not doing well, we see you. We see you. Go take care of yourselves so that you don't take it out on us. And then how do we just notice where we are day to day, moment to moment on this continuum from trauma inducing to trauma reducing? And I lifted up Rise Center before, speaking about like the language and the frameworks. Rise Center partnered with Trauma Transformed. I've had the privilege to work in both places a while back on really thinking about where healing-centered liberation fits into this framework. Trauma-informed can be great language and framework for systems and institutions, and also it leaves out a lot of the community organizing and the words that young people wanted us to insert into this framework, right? So trauma is historical, structural, political, intergenerational, interpersonal, and embodied. And then must be our healing. This is from Conor Paul Dhaliwal, one of the associate directors at the Rise Center. And so looking at these layers of where distress, stress, trauma shows up at the individual level, at the community and place level, the systems and institutional level, and then the intergenerational level, and beginning to think about how do we name that, again, I like to say, like, saying the unsayable is a trauma-informed approach, right? How do we begin to name and notice so that we can then change and name and notice where healing shows up too? This is a really busy slide, y'all. Super busy slide, and I have spent days and days in workshops just on this one slide alone. But I just wanted to, for those of you who need the visual and who need the examples, what do we mean by when healing shows up at the history, legacy, and structural level? What does that even look like? What does it look like at the systems and institutional level? And I like this slide because it gets beyond sort of the system language, right? So there's no evidence-based practices populated throughout these slides, right? Even though some of them might be healing-centered. But really, what are the wisdom traditions, lineages, practices we know have needed to remember individually and collectively that operate and create spaces for healing-centered change and mitigate the dehumanization and distress in each of these layers? So I'm just going to I'm going to take a moment here. So folks, if you can see the slide, if you can interact with it, just take a moment to review some of the ways that dehumanization and distress shows up in these different layers. And also, and more importantly, some of the ways that there was a group of people who contributed to this, what they uplifted in terms of healing and liberation in each of these layers too. What feels like healing and liberation in their contexts, in their systems, in each of these levels. And you can drop in the chat if you'd like anything that really stands out to you. I know that during the pandemic, during the lockdown part of the pandemic, there were a bunch of mutual aid networks that popped up. There have always been mutual aid networks and collective care networks, but there was a proliferation of them during 21, 22. So I'm thinking about that collective care piece. We learned that when systems fail and institutions fail us, that we turn towards each other's in these lineages of mutual aid practices and collective care practices. And how do we sustain those? How do we sustain those? Yeah, thank you, everyone. I feel, yes, it is heavy. Nicole, thank you for naming that. Structural system change is heavy. And so I want to just offer too, as we're moving through the heaviness and naming and noticing what definitely feels heavy, maybe spending a little bit more time under the liberation and healing and reflecting for you, where are the feelings of lightness in your day-to-day? Where are the places that you experience healing and liberation on micro or macro levels in your day-to-day as you go through? Roberta, listening and validating. Thank you. Yeah, what we've heard from young people is we feel listened. When we feel listened to, when we feel seen, that's healing for us. And back to that moral injury, when we know this and we hear this from young people and these kind of institutional structures get in the way, it can lead to some frustration. Young people see that too. And so how do we then know on that interpersonal level if listening and validating is a healing practice, then how do we raise that up to the structural level? And so I'll just say very quickly at Rise, we do a lot of listening campaigns, right? Which is deep, deep listening and honoring. Just days and days where we're just in the practice of listening to each other and with young people. And again, moving that healing-centered practice from the individual and interpersonal level to the community and place level, to the systems and institutional level. Walking in a kindergarten where hugs and belly laughs are liberally given. Yeah. Finding stillness and laughing. Presence in all moments. Yeah, getting out in nature. Yeah, so I just want to invite us all. It has been heavy. I can be a heavy presenter sometimes. And structural change is incredibly heavy work. It can feel really heavy. So I want to invite us. I'm going to do it for myself too, just to shake the body, shake the limbs if that feels soothing for you. Wiggle your toes, use your breath. Sigh, make a noise if you need to. This is heavy work if done alone. And I also want to say that the naming and the noticing, what trauma theory has taught me is that what is stressful is far more vivid. And so we tend to focus on that more, kind of the definition of hypervigilance. How do we, again, going back to Sue's offering, stay connected in our bodies and begin to expand from what's vivid in stress and dehumanization towards what's vivid in all of these wonderful, lovely practices you're sharing in the chat? And then how do we begin again to stay very connected to ourselves and our bodies and expand out toward the collective we, right? How is trauma and stress impacting us? And how might we come together to name, notice it, and metabolize and move that in whatever layer? And all the layers are connected. Let's be real. So I want to take a moment here, a breath. It's a lot. Offering the trauma-informed framework because it is ubiquitous. It is a language that's already in our school systems. Offering that up as one framework that can enable some change in multiple layers and levels, right? Not just within ourselves, but also in our place in community at the systemic and institutional level. So doing a lot of work with trauma-informed principles and how do we align that to the policies, right? We have Trauma Transform has a policy audit tool that takes those who have the power and positionality to set policies in school districts and school sites to be able to begin to align trauma-informed principles to structural change, not just more breathing for individuals to address burnout, but structural change. The change we need to really disrupt the demoralization and the moral injury that is so pervasive. And for me, that's where I get energy, right? That we can begin to contribute to some of this structural change. And some of it comes through, I think it's been said here before, like just paying attention, noticing, naming, and beginning to contribute to the narrative that's being said, and especially the narrative that's not being spoken. So just curious for you all, I know these 3-day Summer Institute, there's been a focus on self-attuning, interpersonal, and now we're in the really murky, sometimes really challenging and definitely heavier places of structural change and institutional change and systems change. But just curious for you all out there who are called to respond to this chat, of these layers of healing, which do you get to spend time contributing to day to day? Chris, systems. Okay. Yes, I see you, Leora. And and which layer might you desire to spend more time in? Community in place. I see community in place. Yeah. And how might we shift just naming that in ourselves? Not how can I abandon this layer that I spend a lot of time in, but how might I expand? How might I expand? Claudia, systems and institutions. Right? And again, understanding that always connected to self and grounded to self, and expanding in the ways that we can, given our privileges, given our positionalities, in collective ways, and how we can begin to expand, because we need all of us. I often say this to Leora too, like we find the people looking for us. We got to find the people looking for us. We got to find our people that are also wanting to expand into systems change, especially as we go through those wider layers, those deeper layers. They are collective dehumanization and requires collective organizing, collective healing practices, not individual. So I just want to stop here, take a breath. Thank you for being in this conversation. Thank you for being in the noticing and naming. And I'm happy to give resources to the SCRR team to send out later on, and just really just taking a moment to be in deep gratitude for the privilege of being in all the layers in whatever ways that we can contribute to moving the needle towards more healing-centered places, practices, yes, but also contexts, conditions, and systems. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Jen. Would you be open to reading the poem you wanted to close with on the left?
Sure. Yeah. It's always good to close with a poem, speaking about like narratives and how we even begin to talk about the unsayable. The Unbroken by Rashani. There is a brokenness out of which comes the unbroken, a shatteredness out of which blooms the unshatterable. There is a sorrow beyond all grief, which leads to joy, and a fragility out of whose depths emerges strength. There is a hollow space, too vast for words, through which we pass with each loss, out of whose darkness we are sanctioned into being. There is a cry deeper than all sound, whose serrated edges cut the heart as we break open to the place inside which is unbreakable and whole while learning to sing. Thank you.